So, welcome to the last class of the trimester. Last history class, anyway. The quiz, remember, being tomorrow. Final part of the multiple part exam, as it were. So, need to find some other time to take an afternoon nap after this. I'm just joking. Yeah, haven't seen any napping in a while, I think. So. That's good. But what I thought I would do, because I remember before we've had excerpts, even in Daras, from the author William Cobbett, author of the Protestant Reformation in England and Ireland, and in which, I've mentioned, he talks about all the horrors of it, that basically how much worse things were as a result of the introduction of Protestantism into the British Isles than things were before. So what I did was I found the actual book in the library and took some excerpts from it. So I'll work that into the class because we don't want to cover too much now because there's a lot of things that we cover this trimester that there's not time to test on. That's going to have to be pushed to the second trimester. So probably be tested in February or March on things that we covered in October or November. So I don't want to push too far ahead. So I'm going to use today to cover this. I've been wanting to cover this. But some things that, again, keeping in mind this is from a Protestant who said that he was a Protestant and that he would die a Protestant. That he was a Protestant born to Protestant parents and would die a Protestant. But he still writes his whole book on how bad it was. So why he never became a Catholic is, knowing all of this, is really quite surprising when you think about it. But in any case, he says that, so talking about Queen Mary's reign, he says, so her reign our deceivers have taught us to call the reign of bloody Queen Mary, while they have taught us to call that of her sister the golden days of good Queen Bess. Okay, this is from a Protestant. And Protestants like to refer to her as good Queen Bess. He says that only deceivers refer to her as that. He continues, they have taken the good care never to tell us that for every drop of blood that Mary shed, Elizabeth shed a pint. That the former gave up every fragment of plunder which the deeds of her predecessors had put in her possession, and that the latter resumed this plunder again, and took from the poor every pittance which had, by oversight, been left to them, that the former never changed her religion, and that the latter changed from a Catholic to Protestant, then to Catholic again, and then back to Protestant, that the former punished people for departing from that religion which she and they and their fathers had been born into, and to which she had always adhered, and that the latter punished people for not departing from the religion of her and their fathers, and which religion, too, she herself professed and openly lived in, even at the time of her coronation. Yet, we have been taught to call the former bloody, and the latter good. So, very scathing, but it doesn't end there. He says, Mary began her reign by acts the most just and beneficent, generously disregarding herself, her ease, and her means of splendor. She abolished the debased currency, which her father had introduced, and her brother had made still baser. She paid the debts due by the crown, and she largely remitted taxes at the same time. So he denounces certain Protestants, who were Protestant figures at the time. He says, a pretty trio of Protestant saints, with quotation marks, quite worthy, however, of Saint Martin Luther. 3 worthy followers of that Luther, who is, by his disciple Melanchthon, called a brutal man, void of piety and humanity, 3 followers altogether worthy of this great founder of that Protestantism, which has split the world into contending sects. But, black as they are, they bleach the moment Cranmer appears in his true colors. So remember how bad Luther was. He said, okay, he's talking about 3 people who are not really famous names, but he says, they're saints, and they're sarcastically calling them that, worthy of Saint Martin Luther, but they look pretty good, and they make Cranmer look pretty good. Oh, sorry, Cranmer makes them look good. The other way around. Cranmer makes them look good. That's how bad he was. So this is now for his denunciation of Cranmer. Of the 65 years that he lived, and of the 35 years of his manhood, 29 years were spent in the commission of a series of acts, which, for wickedness in their nature, and for mischief in their consequences, are absolutely without anything approaching to a parallel in the annals of human infamy. So, some hyperbole there, but the sentiment is clear that he was just unspeakably evil. He says, being a fellow of a college at Cambridge, and having made an engagement not to marry while he was a fellow, he was married secretly and still enjoyed his fellowship. So you have to remember that even when he was supposedly, he was externally a Catholic and functioning as the Archbishop of Canterbury, even then he had already married supposedly in private. Yet the Pope didn't know it. He wouldn't have appointed him otherwise, but he had tried it nevertheless. So, but that practice didn't start when he was supposedly, when he became an archbishop. It had already begun. Even, obviously, it's not like scholars are taking a vow of celibacy. He had made an agreement that while he was at that certain post at the university that he wouldn't marry, but he did it then too. So he says, while a married man, he became a priest and took the oath of celibacy. And going to Germany, he married another wife, the daughter of a Protestant saint, in quotation marks, of course, so that now he had 2 wives at one time, when his oath bound him to have no wife at all. He, as archbishop, enforced the law of celibacy, while he himself secretly kept his German Frau, his wife, the German word for wife, in the palace of Canterbury, having imported her in a chest. So literally, I put her in a trunk, smuggled her into the country. As ecclesiastical judge, he divorced Henry VIII from 3 wives, the grounds of his decision in 2 of the cases being directly the contrary of those which he himself had laid down when he declared the marriages to be valid. In the case of Anne Boleyn, he, as ecclesiastical judge, pronounced that she had never been the king's wife, while, as a member of the House of Peers, he voted for her death, as having been an adulteress, and thereby guilty of treason to her husband. So she was never the queen's wife, but still managed to commit adultery, having been married to him. As archbishop under Henry, which office he entered upon with a false oath upon his lips, he sent men and women to the stake because they were not Catholics, and he sent Catholics to the stake because they would not acknowledge the king's supremacy and thereby perjure themselves, as he had so often done. So, when he was supposed to be the Catholic archbishop, he executed heretics. When he was Anglican, he executed Catholics. become openly, so I might say today, having become openly a Protestant in Edward's reign. Remember Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII, who didn't live long, but enough to cause his own trouble for the church. So having openly become a Protestant during the reign of Edward VI, and openly professing those very principles for the professing of which he had burned others, because their grounds for protesting were different from his. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? As executor of the will of his old master, Henry, which gave the crown, after Edward, to his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, he conspired with others to rob those two daughters of it, and to give the crown to Lady Jane. Remember Lady Jane Grey, who was the head of a... So actually, as I read, she was less than 20 years old, but she was at the head of essentially an insurrection to set up a separate monarchy, to overthrow the descendants of Henry VIII and put her on the throne. So he conspired to put Lady Jane Grey, to give her the crown. That Queen of 9 Days, remember the uprising didn't last long, that Mary actually had Lady Jane Grey put to death, whom he, with others, ordered to be proclaimed. So he got in on that. Somehow he managed to avoid execution for that particular thing, but he was in on that. And then brought, at last, to trial and condemnation as a heretic, and this is during the reign of Mary, he professed himself ready to recant. He declared that the Protestant religion was false, that the Catholic religion was the only true one, that he now believed in all the doctrines of the Catholic Church, that he had been a horrid blasphemer against the sacrament, meaning most likely these must be referring to the Mass here, that he was unworthy of forgiveness, that he had made and signed this declaration without fear. So he signed a recantation. But then, brought to the public reading of his recantation, on his way to the stake, now finding that he must die, so he thought he could get out and avoid execution by professing himself a Catholic with that particular recantation, and carrying in his breast all his malignity undiminished, he recanted his recantation, thrust into the fire the hand that had signed it, and thus expired, protesting against that very religion in which, only 9 hours before, he had called God to witness that he firmly believed. And then Cobbett says, and Mary is called bloody because she put to death monsters of iniquity like this. So that's his rant on Cranmer. Yes. Cobbett, William Cobbett. The author of the book I took this from. So that's what he said about those characters. And I also, I'm going to come back to this later. I have some unfinished notes here on Mary Stewart. But anyway, that's what he had to say about the appellation Bloody Mary and Good Queen Bess and on Cranmer. So, not exactly complimentary. Again, he was a Protestant. Always remember that. He would only have said those things out of a true lamentation, out of what Protestants had done. All right, so now we'll go back to Pope Sixtus V. So we talked about, last time we left off, talking about how he improved conditions. It was in the actual city of Rome that he built an aqueduct, such things like that, such things as that. Of course, for the discharge of all of the duties that he had, and all of these projects he was undertaking, he leaned upon the congregations of cardinals. And in fact, that's even, of course, up until Vatican II, that was a normal way for the Pope to act, was through these congregations. I mean, of course, the SRC, the Sacred Congregation of Rites, the Sacra Rituum Congregatio. If you read authors who describe the ceremonies, rubricis, they are always quoting decrees from the Congregation of Rites, the Sacred Congregation of Rites. And we have all the decrees up to a certain year in the library. And I mean, a lot of it are things that wouldn't affect us now, but every now and then sometimes authors will quote a decree, and you look it up and say, okay, that's interesting, and there was actually a decree on that. So conversely, sometimes they say, this, because of this decree, this is what you have to do, and you look up the decree and you think, how do you get that conclusion from there? So it's why it's good to look those up, because sometimes authors, they weren't infallible themselves, obviously. They didn't always draw correct conclusions, so it's good to check those sometimes. But I mean, it's normal for the Pope to delegate certain things like that to these congregations, because obviously the Pope is not going to be responding to every liturgical inquiry from everywhere in the world. Of course, not necessarily the Sacred Congregation of Rites would either, but they would answer the most pressing questions, the ones that were actually good questions that hadn't been already answered. Because there were some, if anybody who's taken canon law classes, remember the list of responses that the Roman congregations would give, including the prandium one, which was not an actual one, but we'll go into that some other time maybe. But anyway, some of their answers were essentially see our previous decree. In other words, we entered this already. Go look at it before. Some would say post agnos, in other words, after our Easter vacation, post nativitatem, after our Christmas vacation, things like that. Or I think one was post pluvias or something. In other words, after the autumn rains, so once the weather gets better in the fall. But they have all these answers ready. Sometimes they would just give affirmative or negative. Other times they would give a more complicated answer. But other times they would say either figure it out on your own, we already answered this, or we'll get to this later. But I mean, that's how those congregations worked. But I mean, the point is, it's a normal thing for this to happen. Pope's not going to be responding to every single inquiry made to the Holy See. Then these congregations would do a lot of the work. Of course, those things did involve a lot of research in some cases. Of course, they could never act against the will of the Pope. Obviously, it was all running on his authority. It's almost like they were like hooked up to his power source or something. They couldn't do anything that he didn't approve, but he would offload a lot of the I won't say the dirty work, but a lot of the just the research. A lot of the research had to be done by other people. So he said. So Dara says, if he did not found them all these congregations, yet he gave them such. Yet he gave them such a development. So he really organized all of that. Maybe founded at least some of them. But he really developed that and really got it all organized. So, and also something interesting, he fixed the number of cardinals at 70. And he says, as Moses chose 70 elders out of all the people to take counsel with him. And that was observed up until, if I'm not mistaken, John the 23rd. There were always 70 cardinals up until John the 23rd decided to make more than that. So basically there have been 70 cardinals since the time of Pope Sixtus V. And then, let's see. During this time, Frederick Borromeo, who was the nephew and the successor of St. Charles Borromeo, followed in the footsteps of his predecessor, displaying a heroic charity during the Great Plague in Milan. Yes? Cardinals. 70. So you may remember that St. Charles Borromeo died. As the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, he died essentially attending to the sick who were sick of the plague that was raging in Milan at the time, and he died of that. So apparently there's another outbreak during the reign of his nephew and successor, and he did similar work. Okay, so now we'll go back to Lutherans and Calvinists, whose revolutions were continuing their ravages in Germany, the Netherlands, and France. So this is very nicely timed with the book that we're having read currently. Elizabeth was still ruling in England. She ruled for a long time. I don't have her dates in front of me right now, but she ruled for a long time. And it was obviously terrible for the church, not only what Cobbett says, but things we're hearing in the readings, and things we'll see further in our main course here. So Dara says, the imperious queen drew her motives of hatred against Catholicity from her self-love as a woman and from her political interests. So that's politically incorrect of him to say that. Basically, she was a strong-willed woman who also happened to be anti-Catholic, and therefore caused tremendous misery to the church, to Catholics. In 1582, so the same year that Gregory XIII promulgated the Gregorian calendar, she made it a crime of high treason to induce any subject to forsake the state religion for the faith of Rome. So if you got somebody to abandon Anglicanism for the Catholic faith, you were guilty of high treason and were liable to have your head chopped off. That sounds a bit like Bergoglio, who says that it's a great sin against ecumenism to proselytize. He said that a number of years ago. Once he said, first of all, proselytism is their word for evangelizing people. In other words, bringing them, trying to get them to embrace the Catholic faith. They say proselytism, and the Novus Ordo conservative explanation of that is, that means like a forcible, like forcing someone to, through physical coercion of some kind, or coercion of any kind, to embrace the faith. That's not what they mean. They mean just any kind of any effort to bring people to the faith. So Bergoglio once said that proselytism, early on, remember this, it was 2013, he said, proselytism is solemn nonsense. And then, maybe within a couple of years of that, I don't remember exactly when, but he said that proselytism is a great sin against ecumenism. It's probably one of the list of maybe 5 sins left in the Novus Ordo is evangelizing people. Probably giving people into the faith. That's a sin. Against ecumenism, no less. Probably failing to recycle is another one. Admonishing adulterers, that's probably a sin too. I don't know. You could come up with a list of... there are probably about 5 mortal sins left in the Novus Ordo, and that's one of them apparently. Proselytism. Whatever they mean by it, which we know. I mean, it's not difficult to figure it out. But proselytism is one of them. So, the Jesuits had established missions in the kingdom, in England, to oppose the progress of heresy, and Elizabeth gave them 15 days to quit the island. So they had to completely clear out in 2 weeks and 1 day. Probably would have called it a fortnight, the old term for 2 weeks, or thereabouts. Those who did not comply with the despotic order, and they were not few, became the objects of a persecution which recalls the martyr ages of the church. In other words, the early centuries of persecution under the Romans and also, in fact, the Jews. That's not something you hear much about, is that in the early centuries of the church, of course, everybody knows that the Romans, nobody would deny that the Romans persecuted the church, but so did the Jews, actually. There were some brutal persecutions perpetrated by the Jews. You would never hear about that anywhere else. But it's a fact. Probably be considered anti-Semitic just to say it, but it's true. It's like the Jews have a patent on being persecuted or something. Anyway, Darius is referring to that when he's talking about the sufferings of the English Catholics here in the 16th century. He says, meanwhile, an innocent and unhappy victim had been for 18 years pining in a dungeon, anxiously awaiting the hour of justice which she was not to see. All the sovereigns of Europe had displayed a common interest in her sad fate, but their intervention could not avert the fearful vengeance that was soon to fall upon her. A commission of 46 members, chosen from among the peers of the realm and the councillors of the crown, condemned Mary Stewart to death in 1586. Parliament confirmed the sentence and requested Elizabeth to have it carried into immediate execution. The Queen of Scots, so that's Mary Stuart, wrote a touching letter to Pope Sixtus V, declaring her fixed resolve to live and die in the Catholic faith. The Pope had not waited for this last proof of devotion to interest himself in behalf of the Scottish Queen. He had urged Elizabeth the most pressing entreaties in her favor. It may be that his display of active solicitude helped to delay the execution, which took place only on the 18th of February, 1587. So again, I don't have the date of the sentence being passed in 1586, but it was not until the following year that it was actually carried out on the 18th of February, 1587. The crime was, at length, consummated, and a stain of royal blood was fixed forever upon the memory of Elizabeth. In other words, on her record. Sixtus V issued a solemn bull of excommunication against the crowned regicide. So now calling Elizabeth a regicide. In other words, somebody, yes, we talk about the crime of regicide, but somebody who commits that crime is also called a regicide. So she's a crowned regicide. She wears a crown herself, but she killed a queen. He placed England under interdict, declaring Elizabeth a usurper, deposed from all power, and cut off from the communion of the church, ordering the English to join the army to dethrone her, and promising the most extensive spiritual favors to those who should seize her person and deliver her over to the Catholics. At the same time, he entered into a league with Philip II of Spain, engaging to furnish ample subsidies for the war. So the Pope is getting involved in a potential invasion of England here. But the result did not correspond with his anticipation. So, anybody know what it was called, this particular force? Anybody heard of the Spanish Armada ever? No one's ever heard of that? Anyway, it was exactly this. Philip raised an imposing force, but the invincible Armada, the fleet which was to conquer England, was completely destroyed by the elements before reaching its destined field of operations. So yeah, Philip II put together this huge fleet that was supposed to land an army in England, dethrone Elizabeth, and put himself, actually, Philip II, on the throne. The Catholics would, of course, have been very happy to see Philip II ruling over England. Remember, he had to been the king consort of England when Mary Tudor, was still alive. The only Queen Mary of England, as far as I'm aware. But she was, when Mary Tudor was the Queen of England, remember, he was married to her. He spent all of his time elsewhere in Spain, but he was considered the King of England, which was his title. Remember, you may recall that he was to give up that title when Mary Tudor died. And when she did eventually die and the throne came to Elizabeth, he had to give up that title. So now you have here, in some sense, a former King of England planning to invade England. That his former, at least theoretical subjects would have been very happy to see, or many of them anyway, would have been happy with it. Yes.
What was the purpose of putting England under interdict if the Catholics were already struggling to?
That was a common punishment for, especially on a sovereign, to put the nation under interdict. So there was possibly, yes, no liturgical functions at all or anything like that. And I'd have to look up the exact extent of the interdict. Of course, I'm sure that things like confession, certainly in danger of death, would have been still permitted. But I'd have to look that up in canon law, both, well, at least for the time, what exactly was forbidden by an interdict. But the idea of it was that exactly that you would have devout people. I mean, obviously in every nation that has a significant number of Catholics, some of them are going to be devout. You put an interdict on that nation, those people are not going to like it. They're going to put pressure on the sovereign to say, you fix things up right now with the Pope, or we might cause worse trouble for you. So the idea is to put pressure on the sovereign. That's what he's trying to do here. He's putting pressure on, or he's trying to put pressure on Queen Elizabeth to have, at least try to get her subjects to, or former subjects at this point, to get rid of her. So that's the idea of an interdict. It's to put pressure on the sovereign of a realm who is misbehaving for the purpose of fixing things out. And then, of course, the interdict would be lifted after that. And then, actually, as Darius mentions here, yes, the Spanish Armada, it did fail in its objective. They never landed in England, but it wasn't because of any. There was some English naval activity, some military activity on their part that helped to disrupt it, but it was mostly, if not entirely, exactly this: the elements. The Spanish were not the best seamen, or they were not naval experts like the English were. And so the weather did them in, basically. Scattered the fleet, destroyed, sank ships, things like that. To the point that it wasn't able to do anything. By the time it got close enough to the point they wanted to land, they couldn't do anything. In fact, there was even a point at which, of course, should I ask, anybody heard of Francis Drake? Anybody know who that was? He was a pirate, essentially, but he was sponsored by Queen Elizabeth to raid Spanish ships anywhere he could find them. Because the Spanish had this thing of they would put huge amounts of gold on a ship and then send it out, and then it would get, could potentially sink, but then also get waylaid by people like Francis Drake. And they would just take all the gold from that. So it was immensely profitable for all the investors in ships. But it was just highway robbery, or high seas robbery in this case. Nothing short of it. In fact, it even happened once because, of course, Drake was one of the first to circumnavigate the globe after, who else? Yeah. Yes, he was the second one. Remember, I mentioned it before, though maybe nobody remembers it, that Magellan at a certain point marooned some sailors in one spot, and then Francis Drake coming by the way, decades later, I believe it was. Certainly a good amount of time, years, I believe it was decades. Decades later, coming back, found the skeletons of those men in that place and then marooned some more people there. But then he continued his circumnavigation. And so he basically, at that point, he got to the point, so he sailed from England all the way around South America, all the way up the west coast of South America, up onto the west coast of the United States. So, of course, all that was controlled. That was all Spanish territory. Of course, California was all Spanish territory at the time. And at a certain point, you had eventually then an English ship in Spanish waters off the west coast of North America. That was something unheard of. So the Spanish, they had even less motive than ever to have caution in loading up their ships with treasure and sending them out. So it was really easy pickings for Drake. I mean, those ships they were certainly not on their guard for English pirates in the Pacific. That was unheard of. So he just basically It was like just fruit just hanging from the tree. Like, just come along and pick it. So he stole an awful lot from the Spanish. And he was all sponsored by Elizabeth. She was in on it. Maybe not purely by her, but she was in on it, certainly. The crown was definitely had a stake in that. In fact, she knighted him. She made him a knight. She made him Sir Francis Drake on board his ship when he got back. Yeah, these are the kind of characters. Well, kind of character Elizabeth was and the kind of character she hired to do her dirty work. But anyway, going on to Francis Drake, because at a certain point he saw or somebody nearby him saw the Spanish Armada approaching off the coast of England, and went to him and said, "Oh, no, the Spanish are coming," and he said, "Oh, there's nothing really to worry about. They're not close enough." Or, it was true at that point they weren't really even close enough, but they just let the weather destroy the English. Just let the weather destroy the Armada. Didn't do much. So. Yeah, you could spend a long time talking about all of the military operations of the Armada. That's definitely outside of our scope here. But just know that it was the Spanish Armada, very famous. Spanish Armada. Just know that the name of it and that it failed, that it was sent by Philip II, and that Elizabeth was the target of the operation. And that Catholics would have been very happy had it succeeded. So that's England. And go to France. The condition of France, remember we're still in the middle of the wars of religion here, the condition of France was not improved by the death of Charles IX. His successor, Henry III, had married a cousin of the Duke of Lorraine, which was espousing the cause of the House of Guise. Which, remember, the Duc de Guise was of the Catholic cause. So that marriage espoused the Catholic cause. Let's see. But the indolent and voluptuous prince, as Darras calls him, wasted in frivolous pleasures the time which he ought to have devoted to the difficult administration of his kingdom. That the shameless profligacy of the monarch revolted his subjects, in other words, made them disgusted, and thus contributed much to swell the ranks of the factious Calvinists. So he was enough of a wreck that he swelled the ranks of the Calvinists just out of personal revulsion to him. And then, so people went to join them simply because he was so bad, personally bad. So the king's brother, the Duke d'Alençon, quitted the court, quits the court rather, it's an older way of saying it, and joined Henry of Navarre and Condé. Remember, Henry of Navarre, Henry IV. This defection was followed by a new war. The Catholic army, commanded by the Duc de Guise, who won his nickname, or Le Balafré, which means Scarface. So they call him Henri Le Balafré, which we in English would say is Henry Scarface. Sounds a little more elegant in French. Attacked the insurgents at Château Thierry. So they have a battle. Victory favored the right, in this case, of course, meaning the Catholics. But Catherine, remember Catherine de' Medici, she's still exercising influence here, whose crafty policy still ruled in the name of her son, thought it expedient to enter into negotiations with the Calvinists, and the Edict of Blois granted them freedom of worship, places of safety, and a right to sit in the parliaments. So, remember, Catherine de' Medici was the one who really basically held the reins of power during this time. She was she always had the policy of maintaining basically a balance of power between Catholics and Protestants in the country. She didn't want either one to get too strong so that she could control the situation. That was her policy. And so you see here, after every time the Catholics would win a victory against the Calvinists and be in a position to perhaps capitalize on that victory, she would more or less throw it away by concessions like this. These concessions excited the indignation of the Catholics, who formed themselves into a national association for the maintenance of the ancient faith in the kingdom, as of course they were entirely correct in doing. Remember that state, of course, especially a Catholic state, is the obligation of, to say, doing no more than simply tolerating the practice of heresy, of some false religion in the country. There could never be any kind of positive permission or support given to those. They might tolerate it, but no more than tolerate it in order to prevent a greater evil. But they have to get rid of it if they can, basically. So whenever you're winning military victories against these people, the thing to do is to follow up on those victories and not to start granting them concessions, especially when you know from experience, which we've seen, that they're never happy with the concessions that they get. They always want more. They're never appeased. They're always, the old saying goes, you give them an inch, they ask for a mile. It's the same thing. You allow them to practice their heresy, their false religion openly. Next thing you know, they're going to put one of their own on the throne. So Catholics are absolutely right to be upset at concessions like that and being granted. So that was, these Catholics banded together to form this association, so they were definitely right in wanting to do that. This was the origin of the League, which was also called the Holy Union. The members of the association swore to defend the faith of their fathers, to restore to the provinces of the kingdom their ancient rights, franchises, and liberties, such as they were in the time of Clovis. Anybody know who Clovis was? Yes, the one who was baptized, and it was basically his baptism is considered to be pretty much the foundation of France as a nation. Yes, he was baptized to be, of course, a Catholic, and so very much referring back to, the way things were when France was founded as a Catholic nation. To punish, chastise, and put down those who persecute the Union, without any respect of persons, to render prompt and faithful obedience to the chief who should be named. So, had Henry III appreciated the value of his title, Most Christian King, which is a title kings of France had, he would have wished to be the only chief of the League, but he paid little heed to these movements, and the Confederates entrusted to Henri le Balafré made an authority which made him more powerful in France than the monarch himself. So, Henry Scarface is the one who's really heading the Catholic resistance here. Henry III is doing other things. And so it's Henri le Balafré who's really spearheading this effort. So Sixtus had promised to support the members of the League, and Philip II openly proclaimed himself their protector. You see, just on one of the, let's say, less important considerations, but it's still significant, that Philip II openly supports the Catholics who are fighting heretics in France, whereas you might remember that Elizabeth was very sort of underhanded in her support of, for one thing, of course, Francis Drake setting him up, but then also of supporting the rebels in the Netherlands, which was Spanish territory. We saw that Spanish territory at the time. So just one, of course, many contrasts between the many points of contrast and difference, but just one of them, that Philip openly supports the Catholics. Of course, he sees that it's that they're fighting a just war there, and so he openly supports that. So Catholic monarchs support just wars going on in other places. So the death of the Duc d'Alençon at to this juncture, in 1584 specifically, left the succession to the throne full of uncertainty and danger, as Henry was childless. So Henry III didn't have any children. Henry of Navarre thus became the nearest heir, but according to the old constitution of the French monarchy, the throne could not be held by a heretical prince. So, Dara says, France now presented the sad spectacle of a war undertaken for an inheritance not yet open. So Henry III is still alive, and they're already talking about already fighting wars over who will be his successor. So remember, Henry of Navarre is the closest in line. If Henry III were to die, he'd be the one to take over, but he's a Calvinist. So Henry de Guise and his Henri de Guise and his brother, the cardinal, declared that they would use all their power to oppose the accession of a Huguenot to the sovereign power of the most Christian kingdom. Again, that title being given to the most Christian king, therefore it should be the most Christian kingdom. The Pope sanctioned the resolution by excommunicating Henry of Navarre. So I said, well, we don't want a heretic on the throne. Sixtus says, good idea. We'll make sure excommunicate him also. So the contest known as the War of the Three Henrys, so Henry III, Henry of Navarre, and Henry of Guise, began in 1586. So the War of the Three Henrys. The League had lately been organized in Paris under the name of the 16, from the fact that a council was formed, composed of one member from each of the 16 divisions of the city to guard the interests of religion. So if you hear the 16 being referred to, it's the Holy League or the Holy Union, essentially the Catholic resistance to the taking over of Calvinism in the country, in the kingdom. That's the thing, is it's must be a French thing to assign numbers to groups of people. Like remember the nine priests, in 1983, who left SSPX. They referred to SPX calls them the 9. Yes. 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 But then also, actually, speaking of the 3, I think it was in 2012 when SSPX looking like they were very, very close to actually making a deal with, it was Ratzinger at the time, that the Bishop Feller was heading things, and the other 3 SSPX bishops, Bishop Williamson was still one of them, wrote a letter to him saying, we think this is a bad idea, so that became known as the Letter of the 3. So, okay, so I guess next trimester we'll see more about the War of the Three Henrys.